So everybody will have their opinion on the right stuff to use. I'm pretty sold on this 3-bond. I've had really good luck with it for quite a while now, so you want enough on there that you get a good seal, but you definitely don't need too much. So I just try and get a nice thin coat wiped on the whole surface that you want there. I kind of rub it around with my finger first and try to get, decent coating on there. Then after I think I got it where I want it, then I go around and I just kind of tack it with my finger like this. And the camera makes it look like it's totally globbed on there, but it just isn't. So I'll just set it over here. I don't mind letting it tack up for a short amount of time. Then once that bearing cap's done, then we just got to coat this right around in here on the base of the case, if you will. This case was scrubbed clean with Scotch-Brite and denatured alcohol beforehand. And I'll usually take a clean finger. Just going to wipe that inside corner just to make sure you don't have any down in the crankcase area. And everybody will tell you, and I damn near did it again myself, this little grounding strap has to go in there before we put that last bolt in this side to hold the bearing cap. Otherwise, you'll find that you pull the saw all the way back apart just to get that dumb little metal piece in there. Which can be frustrating, especially if you already have the tank and everything else installed. So you get all those tightened down. Give the crank a spin, make sure it feels nice and free. Sure it's not running into anything. If you need to, you can kind of center it with a light tap on either side here. So I just want to say it's downright painful to watch the rest of this video knowing that the crank is in backwards, and it took me so long into the process to realize it. Like I always say, we'd all be a bunch of cocky you-know-whats if we never made mistakes. It's what helps keep us humble. Anyways, hopefully it's not too frustrating watching the rest of the video. This type of clamshell, they usually center themselves pretty well. That bearing cap's on there. So when it comes to putting your transfer covers back on, sure, your gaskets, if they're like any of them that I've done, they hardly ever come off in one piece. You can use whatever your gasket maker of choice is. One thing you do have to be aware of, though, is that these little screws for your transfer covers, without the gasket in there, they're too long and they'll bottom out into the cylinder, back in here, these little pockets only go so deep, right? Otherwise they'd be in to the cylinder wall. Anyways, if you don't grind these just a touch shorter, and I mean, I'm talking 1/8 of an inch, when you go to put them in, they'll bottom out before this is tight. And you'll either end up with an air leak, which is not good, or if you happen to be Hercules and one of these spots inside the cylinder where those pockets are happens to be a little, drilled a little deeper or a little thinner or something, if you tighten it down enough, there is potential to punch through the cylinder wall. Although I think you'd strip the threads out of the aluminum before you'd get that far, but regardless, there are dangers if you put these back on, these caps with gasket maker, and they'll seal up just fine, but make sure you grind these just a touch shorter. Everything's made it up and happy. Got a little bit of gasket maker that squished out right there, so you got good application. And since everything on this saw has been completely apart and cleaned, I usually take a little premix oil and try not to get too crazy, but give the main bearing down there a good little drink. And makes a little smoky on startup, but at least it's got lubrication right off the hop. So, and I don't know if it really makes a difference, but in theory, I like to have them in an orientation where let me see how I can explain this. So if it's in that orientation up and down with the gap on the side, I think it might be far-fetched, but it might not be. The inertia of that piston moving up and down could potentially compress that just a tiny bit at the top or bottom of the stroke as soon as it returns to head the other way. And at 14,000 RPM, I think it's probably possible. Anyways, some people think, myself included, that there's potential for this ring to compress ever so slightly, and then it could potentially pop out of the ring if it's not seated well, or if the ring groove inside of there isn't just perfect. So when I install them, I make sure to put them so the gap is either at the top or the bottom in relation to the stroke. Hope that makes sense. Oh. If you haven't done that at least once or twice, well, kudos to you. So I didn't show it, but I took just a little dab of grease in 4 spots on top of the piston. Cut some pieces of solder. Oh, let me do this right here. Cut some pieces of solder to length and just stuck them on there right to the edge of the piston. Bolted the cylinder on. rolled it through, and you remember I was talking about this. I checked it just in one spot with this bolted on with this piston and no gasket, and I got 18 and almost 19 in some spots with one. I could tell rolling it through it's going to be tighter than I thought it was. So at this point, pulling off, we'll start with the exhaust side. And we're all the way at 15. On the exhaust side, not 18. With solder on this side, that piston had nowhere to rock back like it maybe did a little bit before. Exhaust side was 14. So, got 14 on the exhaust, 14 on the intake. About 15 or 16 on the sides. And there's some, well, that's a big blob of grease in there, but there's some carbon buildup, but for the most part, it's pretty clean. And you won't, I guess maybe you can't make it so you can see it. Yeah, it's not going to work out. Well, yeah, you can see there. There's just imperfections in the casting in the top of the cylinder. And that's where cutting the squish band comes in and is nice because you even all that up. There's no irregularities. They're all the same. But I don't have means to cut squish bands right now, so we're going to have to roll with what we got. So we'll pick the tightest spot, which was 14. And we're going to have to remedy that by making our own gasket that's at least 4 thousandths thick in order to come up with 18 as a minimum. So to make your own gasket, all you have to do is take the original base gasket, find a new gasket material that is suitable to your taste that you're happy with. If you read anything or hear any stories from old timers, they used everything from pop cans to milk cartons to cereal boxes to paper bags. I mean, they used anything and everything under the sun and had saws that held up. So you determine what you think is suitable for a gasket material, but basically find the thickness you want, trace the old one onto it, you're good to go. And if I'm using a paper gasket of any type, then I usually soak it in a little bit of 2-stroke oil first, or at least get it kind of coated. I think it helps everything compress if it's a little bit wet with some oil. Might be a harebrained idea, might not be, I don't know. Anyways, that's what I do. You do what you want to do. Shooting for another 4 to 6 thousandths, and I think this measures like 8. So maybe we'll see once it compresses what it ends up like. But anyways, now that we got our suitable gasket on there, we will cut 4 new pieces of solder and recheck. So here we are again, only this time, hopefully we won't have a huge squish number, but maybe it'll be a little better. So, exhaust side, 20. A little more than what I was after, but you know what? Sometimes when it's meant to be, it's meant to be. 19. And that one's reading Rating 20. 21 almost, just like the other. So, tightest we got was 19, but average was 20 to 21. That's close enough to 20 in my world, and we aren't going to get picky with it. 20 is a good number. Safe, plenty tight. So that's what we're going to go with. So, it's like we did with all the bearings and everything. Get ready to go. I give the piston a good coating of oil. Best to get a little in that ring land. I'll smear on top. Yeah, it's smoky when it starts up, but inside of the cylinder coat. Probably excessive, I'm sure, but got nothing running dry together before oil and fuel get up there. So one thing I will say, I think it's overlooked a lot. People, if you're replacing something with aftermarket or even factory, I guess at times, is to measure the ring end gap. So put the ring in there. Push it up in with a piston so you know it's level all the way around. Take your trusty old feeler gauge. Yeah, you won't be able to see, but just take feeler gauge and run it right into that ring end gap right there. And everybody has their own preferences, like we've said plenty already, but I like 8 thousandths myself. 8 to 10 is kind of where I tend to go, and 8 fits in there just perfect. So I'm happy with that. Well, when it comes time to getting the jug on, if you don't have a ring compressor, I've used fingers or a zip tie or anything else. There's a lot of things that'll work in a pinch, but if you're going to do this more than once, spend the $6 or whatever it costs to get a set of these, and they are worth every penny. So when I put my compressor on, make sure I'm centered over the ring locating pin. And then I just squeeze ever so slightly, and as I pinch it tighter and tighter, I move it back and forth and wiggle it and make sure I'm still centered on that pin. And when you know you're good, I did this backwards, of course, but so hopefully you can see this, and there's better ways than this to do it, but this works as long as you're careful. Anyways, the stock one has that plastic clamp. I already shaved these off, little notches that clip together. but decided to go the route I normally go. So I'm just going to take a slitting disc on a grinder and finish this cut from there all the way around to there. And then once that's off, when the rubber boot goes through, I just use a intake boot clamp off of like a steel, I don't know, 038 or 026, that style. And it ends up going around the rubber part without the plastic on there, and it clamps on there just wonderfully. So and you probably figure out, but might I add that you have to be very careful when you're around that nipple, because if you cut through this side and you don't pay attention, you'll cut that right off, and then you'll be buying a whole new intake horn. Ask me how I know. And frankly, that works. So now, take that, put it through just the way it was before. Now that's through. Partition is on there. Just the same as before, only there's no plastic ring from that partition around this part. And that's perfectly fine, because this fits perfect over that, clamps down on that rubber nice and tight. So as far as I'm concerned, there's only one way to do this, really, and that is to assemble this onto the cylinder first, and then put it down on there. And with these saws, as far as I'm concerned, that's the only way to get a proper fit on there. Or proper seal, I should say, is with that clamp. The aftermarket, or I shouldn't say that, factory replacement one is this kind of clamp. They don't work either, in my opinion.